The room had grown quiet long before the man himself did. By the late 1970s, John Wayne no longer entered spaces with thunder. He arrived slowly, carefully, his tall frame reduced to something fragile, almost unreal. The cancer had already taken his lung years earlier, then his stomach, and now it seemed to be taking everything else that made him recognizable to the world. At 72 years old, weighing barely 140 pounds, the man once known as the embodiment of American toughness had become someone people did not know how to look at anymore. They stared too long. They spoke too softly. Their voices carried sympathy before he even said a word. And every time it happened, it cut deeper than the disease itself. Wayne did not fear death the way people assumed. What he feared was being erased while he was still breathing. He had built a life on presence, on command, on the unspoken authority of simply standing in a room. Now, when he walked in, conversations stopped not out of respect, but out of shock. Faces tightened, eyes filled. He could feel it immediately, that invisible shift, the moment he was no longer Duke the man, but Duke the patient. People meant well. They always did. They told him he was brave. They told him he was an inspiration. They told him they were praying. He nodded, smiled, thanked them, played the role expected of a dying legend. But inside, something far more painful was happening. He was being mourned while still alive. The world saw the final confirmation of this at the Academy Awards in April 1979. When Wayne stepped onto that stage to present the final award of the night, the audience gasped. Some cried openly. The applause that followed was not for the performance, but for the farewell everyone believed they were witnessing. Wayne stood there, thin, unsteady, his once booming voice weakened, yet still doing his job. He finished, walked off, and backstage the ritual continued. Hugs that lingered too long. Eyes full of tears, words chosen carefully, as if speaking too loudly might break him. That night, Wayne understood something with devastating clarity. To everyone else, he was already gone. What very few people understood was how much that hurt him. Wayne had spent his life refusing to be handled gently. He had built his identity on strength, bluntness, and an almost stubborn refusal to ask for sympathy. Now, sympathy was all anyone offered. It followed him everywhere, heavier than the illness itself. And then, in the middle of that quiet suffocation, the phone rang. The voice on the other end did not sound careful. It did not sound sad. It did not sound like someone preparing a farewell. It sounded normal, irreverent, familiar. Dean Martin did not ask how Wayne was feeling. He did not mention doctors or prayers. He simply said he was coming over and told Wayne to make sure he was home and not dying an inconvenient time. Wayne laughed. Not the polite laugh he had been offering the world for weeks, but a real one, the kind that came from relief. His daughter heard it from the other room and froze. She had not heard that sound in a long time. When Martin arrived the next day, the tension in the house was thick. The family had watched how exhausting visitors had become, how much energy it took for Wayne to endure the sadness that followed him everywhere. They expected more of the same. What they did not expect was Martin walking in, taking one look at his old friend wrapped in an oversized robe, and saying exactly the wrong thing in exactly the right way. No softness, no evidence, no acknowledgement of the room's fear. Just a blunt, almost cruel joke that sounded exactly like something he would have said 20 years earlier. For a moment, time stopped. Everyone waited for offense, for pain, for awkward silence. Instead, Wayne smiled. Then he laughed, deeply, loudly, like a man who had just been handed back a piece of himself he thought was already gone. In that instant, he was no longer the dying legend everyone tiptoed around. He was Duke again, not a symbol, not a patient, just a man sitting with his friend. What followed was not a dramatic confession or a heartfelt goodbye. It was something far rarer. It was 2 hours of normal life. Stories that did not matter. Jokes that were not appropriate. Complaints about people who annoyed them. Arguments that led nowhere. And in those 2 hours, something extraordinary happened. John Wayne was allowed to live again, not in the past, not in memory, but in the present, exactly as he was, without apology or pity. That choice, to refuse the script everyone else followed would become one of the quietest yet most profound acts of friendship in Hollywood history. It was not about denying death. It was about denying its power to strip a man of his dignity before it arrived. Long before illness reshaped his body and silence followed him into rooms, John Wayne had already built a life defined by weight, not only physical but symbolic. He was born Marion Morrison, a quiet boy who grew into a towering presence through discipline, repetition, and an almost ruthless sense of self-control. Nothing about the Duke persona came easily. It was carved over decades of work, failure, and stubborn persistence. By the time the world accepted him as the embodiment of American masculinity, Wayne had already internalized a private rule that guided his entire life. A man endured. A man did not complain. A man did not ask to be spared. That rule shaped everything. On sets, Wayne was direct to the point of brutality. He did not waste words. He respected competence and had little patience for insecurity. Crew members learned quickly that earning his approval meant showing up prepared and standing your ground. Actors either folded under that pressure or rose to meet it. Wayne had no interest in pretense. He believed authenticity revealed itself through action, not explanation. That belief made him difficult, admired, feared, and trusted all at once. When he met Dean Martin, the contrast was immediate. Dean arrived with a reputation built on charm, music, and humor. To the public, he was effortless cool, a man who drifted through life with a glass in his hand and a smile that never seemed to crack. Wayne had seen that image and dismissed it. He assumed Martin was another entertainer playing its seriousness, another Hollywood creation not meant to last once the laughter faded. Their meeting on the set of Rio Bravo challenged that assumption almost immediately. Martin was cast in a role that demanded vulnerability, restraint, and emotional honesty. Under the direction of Howard Hawks, there was no room for exaggeration or safety nets. The character required someone willing to look weak on screen, to let the audience see fear, shame, and quiet determination. Wayne watched closely, skeptical at first, then increasingly attentive. What he saw unsettled him. Martin did not hide behind jokes when the camera rolled. He did not overplay the drama. He listened. He waited. He allowed silence to do the work. Wayne recognized something rare in that approach. It was not laziness or indifference. It was confidence without arrogance. Martin did not need to prove himself loudly because he already understood who he was. That realization earned Wayne's respect faster than any compliment ever could. Off camera, their connection deepened in ways neither man advertised. They did not bond through constant contact or public declarations of friendship. Instead, they shared an understanding that required very little maintenance. They talked when they talked. They laughed when they laughed. They did not demand emotional updates or reassurance. In an industry built on appearances, their relationship was almost aggressively real. They allowed each other to exist without explanation. That dynamic mattered more than either man realized at the time. Wayne's life, despite its size, was often lonely. Fame insulated him. Expectations boxed him in. People approached him with admiration, fear, or an agenda. Very few approached him as an equal. Martin did. He never asked Wayne to soften. He never flinched at Wayne's bluntness. He responded with humor, sometimes sharp, sometimes careless, but always honest. That honesty created a rare equilibrium. Years passed. Careers evolved. They worked together again, crossed paths less frequently, but the foundation remained intact. Both men carried private burdens the public never fully saw. Wayne had already faced cancer once, losing a lung and part of his ribs in the 1960s. He survived, returned to work, and treated the ordeal as something conquered, something behind him. That victory reinforced his belief that endurance was not just possible, but expected. Martin, meanwhile, was navigating his own quiet unraveling. His marriage ended. His drinking increased. The easy persona that had once protected him began to thin. Yet even in those moments, he rarely asked for sympathy. He deflected with humor, just as Wayne deflected with toughness. In that sense, they spoke the same emotional language. Neither wanted to be rescued. Neither wanted to be reduced to their struggles. When cancer returned for Wayne in the late 1970s, it returned differently. It was not something to beat and walk away from. It was something that changed the shape of his days, the rhythm of his movements, the sound of his voice. Publicly, Wayne remained defiant. He continued appearances. He refused to disappear. Privately, the cost was immense. His strength faded, but his identity did not. That mismatch created a tension that few people knew how to navigate. Most visitors responded with fear disguised as kindness. They slowed their speech. They softened their eyes. They framed every conversation as if it might be the last. Wayne felt that shift immediately. To him, it was not compassion. It was surrender. It told him that the world had already decided who he was now. Not Duke, not the man, just the ending. Martin understood something others did not, because he had always understood Wayne before. He knew that acknowledgement without pity was the only language his friend would accept. He knew that once you spoke the words of farewell, you could never take them back. And he knew that Wayne did not need help preparing for death. He needed help remaining himself while alive. That understanding was not intellectual. It was instinctive. It came from years of mutual respect, built without ceremony. It came from knowing when to speak and when not to. When Martin decided to visit Wayne, he was not planning a goodbye. He was protecting something fragile and invisible. Wayne's sense of dignity. Everything that followed grew out of that shared past. The jokes, the insults, the refusal to acknowledge what everyone else saw. Those choices only make sense when viewed through the history they shared. This was not cruelty. It was continuity. It was Martin insisting that the man in front of him was the same man he had always known. That is what made those hours so powerful. They were not an exception. They were a continuation. In a life suddenly defined by endings, Martin gave Wayne something far more valuable. He gave him the comfort of familiarity, the reassurance that at least one relationship remained untouched by illness. By the time the illness reached its final stage, the world around John Wayne had already begun to behave as if the story was over. Doctors spoke in careful tones. Schedules were adjusted quietly. Invitations slowed, then stopped. The man who had once dictated the rhythm of entire productions now moved according to his body's limits, and those limits tightened every week. Yet the most painful change was not physical. It was social. Conversations no longer flowed naturally. Every exchange carried an unspoken weight, a sense that time was being measured, counted, rationed. Wayne was fully aware of what was happening. He had lived long enough, worked hard enough, and seen enough people disappear to recognize the signs. He knew his prognosis even when others avoided the word. He understood that the cancer would not be beaten this time. What he could not accept was how quickly people stopped seeing him as present. The room would quiet when he entered, not out of respect, but out of fear. People no longer argued with him. They no longer teased him. They nodded, agreed, smiled gently, as if resistance itself would be unkind. That silence was unbearable. Wayne had never been a man who thrived on tenderness. He thrived on friction, on pushback, on being challenged. Without it, he felt smaller than the illness had already made him. In those weeks, he withdrew more often, not because he wanted to be alone, but because being seen that way felt like a kind of humiliation he had no words for. Public appearances became acts of defiance. Each one cost him dearly, but he refused to retreat quietly. When he stepped onto the stage at the Academy Awards in the spring of 1979, he knew exactly what the audience saw. He felt their shock before they made a sound. He heard their applause and understood what it meant. They were not applauding the moment. They were applauding the ending. He smiled anyway. He did what was expected. He finished. He exited. And backstage, the ritual resumed. People gathered around him as if drawn by gravity. They spoke about legacy, about courage, about how much he meant to them. Every sentence sounded like a eulogy delivered too early. Wayne absorbed it politely, but each word reinforced the same message. You're no longer here with us. You're on your way out. That was the moment Dean Martin recognized from a distance. He did not need to be in the room to understand what Wayne was experiencing. He had seen it happen to others. He had felt the shift himself in quieter ways as he aged, as roles changed, as applause softened. He knew that the greatest cruelty of terminal illness was not pain, but isolation disguised as care. When Martin decided to visit Wayne, he did so without ceremony. He did not announce it publicly. He did not consult anyone about how to behave. He trusted his instinct, the same instinct that had guided him through decades of performance and private loss. He knew that if he walked into that house carrying sorrow, the visit would collapse under its own weight. He knew that if he acknowledged death openly, it would dominate everything that followed. So he chose a different path, one that only someone with a long shared history could choose. The day he arrived, the house felt tense. Family members moved carefully, as if noise itself might be dangerous. Wayne sat wrapped in a robe that no longer fit his body, his posture still proud but clearly strained. When Martin entered the room, there was a pause, a moment where reality threatened to intrude. Wayne looked thinner. His face was drawn, his strength visibly diminished. Martin saw all of it. He simply refused to respond the way everyone else had. Instead, he spoke the language they had always spoken, insults disguised as affection, humor edged with familiarity. No evidence, no question, no acknowledgement of fragility. The shock in the room was immediate, but Wayne's reaction was even faster. He laughed, not out of politeness, not out of obligation. He laughed because, for the first time in months, someone had not adjusted themselves around his illness. That laughter changed everything. It broke the invisible barrier that had formed between Wayne and the world. For the next 2 hours, the illness might as well have been in another room. Martin did not ask how Wayne felt. He did not bring up doctors or treatments. He did not slow the conversation or soften his tone. He talked the way he always had, about trivial things, about people who annoyed him, about industry nonsense that no longer mattered. Wayne responded in kind. He interrupted. He argued. He corrected details. He complained. He coughed sometimes, paused, caught his breath, then continued. Martin waited without fuss and picked up where they left off. There was no awkwardness in those pauses. No concern that acknowledging weakness might ruin the moment. Weakness was simply allowed to exist without becoming the focus. Observers later described the scene with quiet astonishment. Wayne's daughter would recall that she saw more life in her father during those hours than she had seen in weeks. He was not conserving energy. He was spending it. And he was doing so willingly, joyfully, because the exchange gave him something worth spending it on. Martin understood something profound in that moment. He understood that dignity is not preserved through comfort. It is preserved through recognition. By treating Wayne exactly as he always had, Martin affirmed that the man sitting in front of him was still fully present, still deserving of the same irreverence, the same honesty, the same lack of fear. When it was time to leave, Martin did not linger. He did not draw the moment out. He stood, made a joke about having somewhere to be, and turned toward the door. There was a brief moment where the weight of everything they had not said passed between them. It would have been easy to break then, to confess, to apologize, to say goodbye. Martin did none of those things. He chose restraint over release. He chose his friend's needs over his own emotions. He made one last joke, waited for Wayne's response, and left. Wayne never saw him again. 2 months later, Wayne died. By then, the pain had worsened, consciousness faded in and out, and the world finally received the ending it had been rehearsing for. At the funeral, Martin stood among other legends, carrying the casket of a man he had refused to mourn prematurely. When asked later if he had known that visit would be the last, Martin admitted that he had. When asked why he did not say goodbye, his answer was simple. Wayne did not need goodbye. He needed to be treated like he was still alive. That choice transformed an ordinary visit into something enduring. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not make headlines at the time, but it became the moment people remembered most clearly when they spoke of Wayne's final days. Not the speeches, not the awards, not the standing ovations, but the afternoon when someone walked in, looked past the illness, and spoke to the man as if nothing had changed. After the visit, something subtle but unmistakable shifted in the final weeks of John Wayne's life. The illness did not retreat. The pain did not lessen. His body continued to weaken in ways no amount of willpower could reverse. Yet the emotional atmosphere around him changed, not because the circumstances improved, but because one moment had broken the spell that had been suffocating him. For a brief time, Wayne had been reminded that he still existed as himself, not as a symbol of decline. That reminder lingered. Those closest to him noticed the difference. He spoke a little more sharply again, not out of anger, but familiarity. He reacted to conversations with opinion rather than endurance. When visitors came, he tolerated them with more patience, as if the pressure had eased slightly. The world still treated him like someone fading, but inside, Wayne had reclaimed something essential. He no longer felt entirely erased. The impact of that visit extended beyond Wayne himself. His family, especially his children, saw clearly what most people missed. They understood that kindness, when shaped by fear, can become its own form of cruelty. Watching their father surrounded by love that felt heavy, cautious, and sorrowful had been exhausting. It forced him into a role he never chose, the role of someone being prepared for departure rather than someone still living. Dean Martin's presence cut through that with startling clarity. He did not bring comfort in the traditional sense. He brought recognition. That recognition carried consequences. It reframed how those closest to Wayne thought about his final days. Instead of measuring time by how little was left, they began to focus on what still existed. Small moments, familiar rhythms, the dignity of choice. Wayne was not interested in long conversations about legacy or meaning. He had lived his life on his own terms and wanted to finish it the same way. Martin's visit validated that desire without ever stating it outright. In the wider circle of Hollywood, the effect was quieter but no less significant. News of the visit did not spread immediately, but the story eventually surfaced, not as gossip but as reflection. People began to talk about how different Martin's approach had been. Not better in a moral sense, but more attuned to what Wayne actually needed. In an industry that often confuses sentiment with sincerity, that distinction mattered. When Wayne passed away in June 1979, the public response was enormous. Tributes poured in. Articles praised his strength, his influence, his contributions to cinema. The narrative followed a familiar arc, honoring a legend and closing the book on a towering career. What the public did not see was how carefully curated that ending already was long before he died. How many goodbyes had been spoken too early? How many tears had been shed while he was still listening? At the funeral, Dean Martin stood among men who had shared Wayne's era, carrying the weight of ceremony with restraint. He did not speak publicly about his final visit that day. He did not claim special insight or privilege. He carried the casket, stood in silence, and allowed the moment to pass without inserting himself into it. That restraint was consistent with everything he had done before. He had never been interested in being seen as the most compassionate person in the room. He had been interested in being the right one. When asked later why he chose not to say goodbye, Martin's answer revealed the deeper consequence of his choice. Saying goodbye would have shifted the moment away from Wayne and toward himself. It would have given him closure at the cost of his friend's comfort. By refusing to do that, Martin accepted a quieter burden. He left without release, without final words, trusting that the relationship did not require them. That decision carried its own weight in the years that followed. Martin outlived Wayne by more than a decade, and as time passed, the story of that visit grew in significance. Not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicted instinct. Most people, when faced with loss, act to protect themselves from regret. They say what they feel. They seek absolution. They prepare themselves for absence. Martin chose to remain present instead. The consequences of that choice are still felt whenever the story is told. It challenges deeply ingrained ideas about what kindness looks like at the end of life. It questions the assumption that comfort must always be soft, that love must always be expressed through words, that grief must always be acknowledged immediately to be real. In Wayne's case, those assumptions would have taken something from him rather than given. Wayne's final days were not transformed into something easy or peaceful. There is no illusion of a gentle ending here. What changed was the tone of his remaining time. He was allowed to occupy it as himself, not as an object of sympathy. That allowance did not cure him. It dignified him. For those who witnessed it, the lesson was unsettling in its simplicity. Love is not always about easing pain. Sometimes it is about refusing to redefine someone by their pain. That refusal requires courage, restraint, and a willingness to carry unspoken emotion alone. Martin accepted that cost quietly. In the end, the impact of that visit cannot be measured in hours or conversations. It is measured in what Wayne did not have to endure. He did not have to pretend gratitude for pity. He did not have to perform bravery for reassurance. He did not have to say goodbye before he was ready. He was allowed, briefly but meaningfully, to remain whole. For 2 hours that afternoon, the ordinary rhythms of life returned to John Wayne's living room. The cancer continued its relentless progression, yet remained only a backdrop, not a protagonist. Dean Martin's visit transformed the space, and by extension Wayne's perception of it, into a temporary sanctuary where nothing needed to be about illness, decline, or mortality. Stories bounced back and forth between them. Some were trivial, entirely unimportant to anyone else, but somehow riveting to the two men. Other stories carried the weight of memory, recollections from sets long past, anecdotes about directors and fellow actors, complaints about the younger generation who could not carry themselves on camera, and humorous exaggerations about Hollywood marriages that seemed more like caricature than reality. Wayne's laughter returned in its true form. Deep, unabashed, unpredictable. It startled the family at first, because they had grown accustomed to a quiet, controlled Wayne, a man of endurance and solemnity, who had surrendered in some way to the expectation of being mourned while still alive. But as Martin told one story after another, Wayne interjected, correcting him with the precision of someone used to command, challenging him with retorts, offering his own punchlines. At one point, he coughed mid-story, a harsh reminder of the frailty of his body, and Martin waited patiently, as he always had, to finish the joke for him, deliberately mangling the ending to force Wayne to correct him, eliciting another round of laughter. It was a rhythm of give and take, equal parts familiarity and rebellion against the environment of careful sorrow that had dominated Wayne's days for weeks. Observing this exchange, Wayne's daughter recognized a transformation in her father that she had not witnessed for months. The gestures, the words, the tempo of conversation, all the markers of normalcy, had returned. The man in front of her was no longer a shadow of a legend slowly fading from the world. He was Duke, stubborn, sharp-tongued, irreverent, fully alive within the limitations of his body. She saw him trade insults, correct misstatements, argue about the merits of directors, and laugh at jokes about cowboys and showgirls. The scene was charged not by drama or tragedy, but by authenticity, by the return of a selfhood that had been stifled by the well-meaning pity of others. Martin's approach revealed something rarely understood about friendship and human dignity. Most people, when facing a friend who is terminally ill, act out of anticipation of loss rather than recognition of presence. They bring comfort, expressions of fear, or their own grief. Their kindness often masks an unconscious desire to prepare themselves for absence. Martin subverted all of that. He entered Wayne's home not as a mourner or caretaker, but as a peer, as an equal, as someone who refused to let the world define the moment. He acknowledged the decline only indirectly, through humor, through irreverent observation, through insistence on conversation that did not revolve around death. In doing so, he preserved Wayne's dignity in a way that no words of sympathy could. This act was not trivial. It required courage and empathy, qualities that are difficult to enact when confronted with the stark realities of terminal illness. Martin had to resist the instinct to offer closure, the instinct to express fear or sorrow. Instead, he chose to center his friend's experience. He gave Wayne the rarest gift, 2 hours in which he could occupy the space fully as himself, in his own time, in his own voice, without the constraints of social expectation or the performative grief of others. For Wayne, this was more sustaining than any medical intervention. It was a reaffirmation of identity, an assertion that the man in the chair was not only present but entitled to that presence. The quiet power of those hours extended beyond the immediate experience. The family and anyone who bore witness absorbed lessons in human dignity and the ethics of care. They realized that sometimes the kindest act is not to smooth pain or offer consolation, but to affirm autonomy, to recognize agency even when strength is limited. The visit illustrated that friendship at its most profound does not always manifest in spoken declarations or physical comfort. Sometimes it is about the refusal to reduce someone to their suffering, about insisting that the person remains more than the sum of their ailments. Wayne himself understood this instinctively. He had spent decades managing his public persona, balancing perception, authority, and authenticity. He knew how easy it was for others to redefine him in moments of vulnerability. Martin's choice to act differently, to ignore the usual scripts of condolence and caution, validated Wayne's life and identity. It reaffirmed the principle he had lived by: a man endures, a man persists, and a man's essence cannot be redefined by circumstance alone. Even as the body fails, the self retains its authority when recognized appropriately. The lessons of those hours resonate because they challenge conventional notions of caregiving and empathy. We often assume that support requires deference, softness, or verbal affirmation. Martin's presence demonstrates that genuine care can be delivered through engagement that respects the totality of a person. By meeting Wayne with humor, irreverence, and attentiveness to his natural voice, Martin offered a form of love that could not be replicated through conventional sentimentality. It was a radical affirmation of life in the shadow of death. As Wayne's final weeks unfolded, the family and those close to him carried the imprint of that afternoon forward. Even as he grew weaker, even as consciousness wavered, that sense of being fully recognized, being allowed to occupy his own self, provided sustenance. Wayne remained aware, in those moments, that not all interactions would reduce him to a patient, that not all gestures would be measured against the inevitability of death. He had been seen as Duke, as a man, as himself, and in that recognition lay a dignity and comfort deeper than words could articulate. Martin's departure, quiet and unceremonious, was consistent with this ethos. He left the room without a drawn-out farewell, without turning the moment into a confessional or a goodbye. By doing so, he preserved the authenticity of the encounter, leaving Wayne with ownership of the experience, undiluted by grief or sentimentality. The act was subtle but potent. It affirmed autonomy, validated identity, and allowed Wayne to exist fully, even if temporarily, in a world otherwise defined by his decline. This visit, though brief, casts a long shadow over the narrative of Wayne's final months. It reframes the understanding of what it means to accompany someone through illness and mortality. It emphasizes that the greatest acts of friendship are often invisible, quiet, and radically attentive to the needs of the other rather than the emotions of the self. In a life marked by public display, it is a rare instance of intimacy that is both profound and unspoken. In the weeks following Dean Martin's visit, the lingering effect of that afternoon became clear in subtle but profound ways. John Wayne moved through his remaining days with a quiet reinforcement of self. The cancer was relentless, yet for the first time in months, he carried himself with a sense of presence that seemed almost impervious to it. He laughed more, spoke more, and engaged with his family and friends in a rhythm that echoed the way he had lived his life before illness imposed its heavy hand. Those 2 hours had done something more enduring than comfort. They had restored his agency, if only temporarily, at the very time it was under siege. Wayne's reflections on those moments would never be spoken aloud, yet they resonated through the behaviors he displayed. He reclaimed fragments of identity that had been eroded by pity and fear. When family members tried to shield him from fatigue or anxiety, he resisted in small, deliberate ways. A story he wanted to tell, a jest he wished to make, a correction he insisted on delivering. All these acts became subtle assertions that he was not merely a patient, a symbol, or a fading figure to be mourned preemptively. He was Duke, fully, in the moments that mattered most. The broader significance of Martin's gesture extends far beyond the personal. It illuminates an essential truth about legacy and human connection, that the value of a life is not measured only by accomplishments or recognition, but by the acknowledgement of one's presence in its most authentic form. Martin did not attempt to rewrite the narrative of Wayne's life or sanitize the final chapters for the comfort of others. Instead, he met Wayne exactly where he was, responding not to expectation or fear, but to the unspoken needs of the friend he had known for decades. This distinction between sympathy and recognition, between sentiment and authenticity, is what made the visit so powerful. It is telling that in recounting those final days, Wayne's family emphasized the laughter, the debate over directors, the jokes about Hollywood absurdities, and the playful sparring that Martin instigated. These moments were not grand or dramatic, yet they carried more emotional weight than any speech or eulogy ever could. They reinforced the principle that identity is not solely a matter of physical capability or public persona. Even in the waning days of life, dignity can be preserved when another sees you not as an object of sorrow, but as a person fully present, capable of humor, judgment, and engagement. The quiet consequences of that visit also shaped Martin's own understanding of friendship, mortality, and human responsibility. He had chosen to prioritize Wayne's needs over his own impulses for closure or self-expression. He had resisted the culturally ingrained assumption that a friend's illness demands expressions of pity or overt farewell. Instead, he acted in a way that respected the integrity of Wayne's experience. Martin's decision exemplifies an often overlooked form of courage, the willingness to contain one's own emotions, to suppress the urge to impose meaning or closure, and to provide a gift of recognition that leaves the recipient in control of their own life narrative. This philosophy, as recounted by Martin's daughter and later by others who studied the interaction, carries lessons for anyone who accompanies loved ones through illness or mortality. It challenges conventional wisdom about what care should look like. Comfort is not always verbal or tactile. Sometimes it is the restoration of agency, the refusal to reduce a person to their frailty, and the commitment to meet them in a space where they remain themselves. In these moments, dignity becomes the currency of care, and presence outweighs consolation. Wayne's brief return to full presence, enabled by Martin's deliberate choice to engage him on equal footing, can also be understood as a rehearsal for the meaning of legacy. Even as his physical body faltered, the identity he had spent a lifetime building remained intact in the eyes of someone who had known him long enough to see beyond appearances. That recognition, unencumbered by fear or sentimentality, reinforced the continuity of Wayne's character, his enduring values, and the essence of who he was as a man and as a public figure. It is worth noting that the broader Hollywood environment did not always support such authenticity. Celebrities, particularly those of Wayne's stature, are often surrounded by layers of deference, calculated admiration, and cautious engagement. Most visitors approached him with pre-packaged phrases of respect, reassurance, or grief. Martin's act disrupted that pattern, demonstrating that even within a world structured around image and expectation, intimacy and recognition can exist when attention is focused entirely on the individual rather than on collective sentiment or personal relief. In these final weeks, the ripple effect of Martin's approach extended to Wayne's family, friends, and those who would hear about the visit later. The story became emblematic of a different way to understand love, friendship, and the ethics of care at life's end. It suggested that the truest acts of compassion might not be visible, might not be dramatic and might not be immediately recognized by an audience, but they leave an indelible imprint on the person who receives them. In Wayne's case, that imprint was the restoration of a measure of vitality, a sense of control, and the affirmation of his enduring identity, even as the body failed. Ultimately, these moments illustrate the profound distinction between being cared for and being recognized. To be cared for is often to be treated gently, protected, or consoled. To be recognized is to be fully acknowledged as one is, without reduction, without assumption, and without preemption of the inevitable. For John Wayne, Martin's visit exemplified the latter, providing a clarity and a presence that outlasted even the physical duration of the encounter. The days that followed Dean Martin's visit carried a quiet weight that no one else could have shifted. John Wayne continued to move through the routines of his life, each step measured by the limitations imposed by his illness, yet each step now also marked by a subtle resilience. The cancer, relentless and indiscriminate, progressed as predicted, but Wayne's spirit remained fortified in a way that surprised even those closest to him. He had been granted, however briefly, a reprieve from the emotional burden of pity, a return to being recognized as the man he had always been rather than the patient the world expected him to be. In the quiet hours of his home, Wayne found solace in the echoes of that afternoon. He remembered the cadence of their conversation, the precise timing of jokes, the playful contradictions, the irreverent humor that had once defined his life on sets and stages. Those moments were not merely entertaining. They were restorative. They reaffirmed the autonomy he had fought to maintain for decades, the dignity he had cultivated as a cornerstone of his public and private self. In a life so thoroughly observed, so heavily documented, and so frequently judged, these hours provided a rare glimpse of total freedom. The ability to exist without being measured against expectations, to speak, laugh, and argue without constraint, and to be seen fully by someone who had known him in every dimension. Wayne's family observed these subtle changes with quiet relief. His laughter returned more frequently. His remarks carried the bite and clarity that had once made him formidable, and he engaged with the world on terms he chose rather than those prescribed by the weight of sympathy. They saw him reclaim fragments of identity that had been overshadowed by illness, and they understood that these fragments were more precious than any temporary relief from pain or discomfort. Martin had provided a model for how to honor the dignity of someone facing mortality, not by shielding them, not by comforting them in a traditional sense, but by affirming their continued agency, their continued presence, and their enduring essence. In the wider context of his legacy, this interaction became emblematic of a deeper truth about life, friendship, and the ethics of care. True intimacy, it suggested, is not always measured in expressions of grief or overt acts of compassion. It can reside in the attentiveness to the unspoken needs of another, in the courage to resist the instinct to preemptively grieve, and in the discipline to allow a person to inhabit their own experience fully, even in the face of decline. By refusing to cast Wayne solely as a patient, Martin allowed him to reclaim a sense of continuity with the life he had built, the identity he had honed, and the persona he had embodied for decades. Wayne's public image remained that of a legendary actor, the Duke, the embodiment of a generation of Western heroes. Yet privately, the most enduring narrative of his final months was shaped by the ordinary and unassuming act of recognition. The visit did not make headlines. It did not garner awards or public acknowledgement. Its significance lay entirely in its effect on Wayne's lived experience. It demonstrated that the final chapter of a life, no less than the first, can be defined by the recognition and respect afforded by those who understand the person behind the myth. When Wayne passed away 2 months later, the public mourned a hero, a symbol of American cinema, and a cultural icon. Yet in the quiet reflection of those who had witnessed his final days, the story that endured was not that of his illness or his decline, but of the friendship that honored his humanity. Martin's presence allowed Wayne to leave the world having been fully seen, fully recognized, and fully engaged with in the way he most valued. This lesson resonates far beyond Hollywood, reminding us that dignity, presence, and recognition are perhaps the most profound gifts we can offer one another in the face of life's inevitable conclusion. The funeral itself was a gathering of the pantheon of the era, colleagues, friends, and contemporaries who had shared stages, sets, and memories. Martin stood among them not to assert his own grief, but to honor the continuity of Wayne's identity. He carried the casket with steady hands. As others looked on, their sorrow mingled with respect. When asked later whether he had expected that his visit would be the last, his response was measured. He had known, but there had been no need for final words. Wayne had already been given what mattered most, the affirmation that he remained himself until the very end. In reflecting on these moments, the story of Dean Martin and John Wayne emerges as a parable of friendship, human connection, and the preservation of dignity. It reminds us that the most meaningful gestures are not always those performed for public recognition or immediate comfort, but those that recognize and honor the essence of another person, even when the body is failing. The courage to resist conventional expressions of pity, to focus instead on sustaining identity and presence, defines the highest form of care. Martin's choice to visit Wayne in that manner provides a blueprint for understanding what it means to accompany someone at the end of life with respect, empathy, and love that is both quiet and profound. As the world remembers John Wayne for his films, his charisma, and his enduring persona, the quiet lesson of his final days remains a testament to the power of friendship and recognition. For those who accompanied him, the memory of Martin's visit continues to illuminate the essential truth that even in the face of mortality, the affirmation of one's life, identity, and dignity is the most extraordinary gift one can give or receive. In this light, Wayne's final moments were not defined solely by the inevitability of death, but by the enduring presence of someone who truly saw him, who honored him, and who allowed him to be Duke fully until the end. This story leaves a lasting impression. Life's greatest acts of compassion often exist in the recognition of who a person is, rather than the mitigation of what they are facing. To see someone fully, without reducing them to their pain, is perhaps the most meaningful legacy we can leave behind.